Hey there, night owls and history enthusiasts. Dim those lights, snuggle up under your coziest blanket, and let's float together into another journey through the past. Tonight, we're going to dive into a question that might have kept a few of you up at night, or at least it's the kind of thing that makes you go, huh, right before you drift off. We're talking about how Native Americans, specifically those living in various parts of North America, managed to stay, not frozen solid during those long, brutal winters, all while living in structures that, to our modern eyes, might seem a bit, breezy. So let's just gently unfold this historical blanket, shall we? When we picture a tent in winter, our minds probably go straight to some flimsy canvas thing that barely keeps the wind out, let alone the frost. And that's a fair assumption if you're thinking about a modern camping tent. But the structures we're discussing, often referred to as tipis, wigwams, longhouses, or even earth lodges, were far, far more sophisticated than just a piece of cloth strung between some poles. These were homes, meticulously designed and adapted over centuries to face the very real, very unforgiving elements. It wasn't just about throwing some hides together and hoping for the best. There was some serious indigenous engineering at play. Now, it's easy for us, sitting here in our climate-controlled homes with central heating and triple-pane windows, to imagine the sheer misery of a winter night without all that. But let's remember, these were people who lived intimately with their environment, observed it, understood it, and learned to work with it rather than against it. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving, creating vibrant cultures, complex societies, and yes, surprisingly cozy winter dwellings. Let's start with one of the most iconic images that probably pops into your head when you think of Native American housing, the teepee. And yes, I know, TP is often how it's spelled, but teepee is the more traditional spelling, derived from the Lakota word tipi, which literally means to dwell or a dwelling. So we'll stick with teepee, just to be properly sleepy historian accurate. These conical structures, often associated with the nomadic tribes of the Great Plains like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Crow, might look simple from the outside, but inside, oh boy, that's where the magic, or rather the practical genius, happened. Imagine, if you will, a blustery January night on the open plains. The wind is howling, the snow is drifting, and it feels like the kind of cold that just seeps into your bones. And yet, inside a well-constructed teepee, a family could be relatively comfortable. How? Well, it wasn't just a single layer of hide or canvas. Oh no, that would be far too simplistic for these ingenious folks. A proper winter teepee was a marvel of layered insulation and clever airflow management. The basic structure of a teepee involved a framework of poles, typically lodgepole pine, which were surprisingly strong and flexible. These were arranged in a cone shape, tied at the top, and then covered. Now, the covering is where things get interesting. Originally, for many plains tribes, this covering would have been made from bison hides. And not just any bison hides. These were carefully prepared, tanned, and sewn together with sinew, creating a surprisingly durable and water-resistant outer shell. Think about it. A bison is a massive animal, and its hide is incredibly thick and insulating. So, multiple hides sewn together would already provide a decent barrier against the wind and snow. But that's just the outside. The real secret sauce for warmth in a teepee was the liner. Inside the outer cover, there was often an inner liner, sometimes called an edwis. This liner, also made of hides or later canvas, extended from the ground up to about 7 or 8 feet high. Now, why an inner liner? Well, this created an airspace between the outer cover and the inner liner. And what's one of the best insulators we know? Trapped air, of course. This air pocket acted like a giant breathable duvet for the entire dwelling. Now, let's talk about the smoke flap. You see that opening at the very top of a teepee? That's not just for aesthetics, it's a crucial part of the heating and ventilation system. Inside a teepee, usually near the center, there would be a small fire pit.
And of course, where there's fire, there's smoke. The smoke flaps, which were adjustable, could be manipulated with long poles to create a draft that would draw the smoke up and out through the opening at the top without letting in too much cold air or letting out too much heat. It was a delicate balance, an art form really, to manage those flaps depending on the wind direction and strength. A well-tended fire and properly adjusted smoke flaps meant a relatively smoke-free and warm interior. It's almost like they had figured out the principles of thermodynamics without needing a textbook. Imagine that. The ground inside a teepee was also treated with care. It wasn't just bare dirt. Often the ground would be covered with layers of insulating materials. Think dried grasses, woven mats, or more animal hides. This created another layer of insulation from the cold earth, preventing heat loss from below and making the floor much more comfortable for sitting and sleeping. And speaking of sleeping, families would often sleep with their feet towards the fire, sharing body heat and tucked under thick robes or blankets made from furs. The teepee also had a clever feature called a draft shield or skirt around the base of the teepee. This was essentially a continuous strip of hide or canvas that ran around the interior base of the teepee, tucked under the edges of the outer cover. This helped to seal off any drafts that might try to sneak in from the ground level, ensuring that the precious warm air stayed inside, where it belonged. It was a sophisticated system, really, for a dwelling that could be packed up and moved, because, of course, these were nomadic people, so their homes had to be both efficient and portable. Imagine trying to pack up your brick house and move it every few weeks. No, thank you. Let's float over to another type of dwelling, one that was more stationary but equally well adapted for winter, the wigwam. Now, the term wigwam is often used broadly, but it generally refers to domed or semi-domed structures used by various Algonquin-speaking peoples, particularly in the northeastern woodlands and Great Lakes regions. Unlike the teepee, which was designed for portability on the open plains, wigwams were more permanent or semi-permanent structures, often used by groups who practiced a mix of hunting, gathering, and horticulture. A wigwam's construction involved a framework of bent saplings, typically birch or willow, which were then covered with various materials. And this is where the insulation truly comes into play. These coverings weren't just simple layers. They were often incredibly effective at keeping the cold out. Materials like bark, especially birch bark, which is naturally waterproof and durable, woven mats made from reeds or cattails, or even layers of animal hides were meticulously attached to the framework.
But similar to the teepee, the secret wasn't just the outer layer. Wigwams often featured multiple layers of these insulating materials. Imagine a layer of bark, then perhaps a layer of woven mats, and sometimes even an inner layer of hides. This created those crucial air pockets, trapping warmth and preventing the harsh winter winds from penetrating. The domed shape itself was also advantageous. It shed snow effectively and presented less surface area to the wind compared to a boxier structure. Inside a wigwam, just like in a teepee, a central fire pit would provide heat, and again, a carefully designed smoke hole at the top would allow smoke to escape. The floor would be covered with insulating materials, layers of dried leaves, pine needles, furs, and woven mats, making it a surprisingly cozy spot. Families would sleep close together for shared warmth, bundled in their animal skin robes. It was a communal warmth, a strategy that many indigenous groups employed. No individual heating pads or electric blankets, just good old-fashioned body heat and well-prepared animal hides. Consider the Iroquois longhouse, a truly impressive architectural feat. These were massive, elongated structures, sometimes hundreds of feet long, housing multiple related families. The Iroquois, living in the dense forests of what is now New York State and surrounding areas, faced incredibly harsh winters. The longhouse was their answer. It was essentially a giant communal apartment building designed for maximum efficiency and warmth. The longhouse framework was made of sturdy poles covered with overlapping sheets of elm bark, a material chosen for its durability, water resistance, and insulating properties.
The bark was carefully peeled, flattened, and then lashed to the wooden frame, much like shingles on a roof, creating a surprisingly tight and insulated shell. And again, the overlapping nature of the bark created tiny air pockets, adding to the insulation. Inside a longhouse, things were even more communal. There would be multiple fire pits spaced along the central aisle, each serving two families who had their living quarters on opposite sides of the aisle. The smoke from these fires would rise and exit through openings in the roof directly above, which were also cleverly designed to be partially closed in winter to retain heat. This meant that the entire length of the longhouse was warmed by these fires. The sleeping platforms inside a longhouse were often raised off the ground, sometimes several feet, providing a bit of extra insulation from the cold earth. These platforms were covered with mats and furs, creating warm sleeping areas. And with so many people living together, sharing multiple fires, the sheer amount of body heat generated would have significantly contributed to keeping the entire structure warm. It was a testament to communal living and collective resilience against the elements. You might lose a bit of personal space, but you definitely gained in warmth, which in the dead of winter is a pretty good trade-off. Let's gently meander over to the earth lodges found among tribes of the Great Plains and the Missouri River Valley, such as the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. These were perhaps the ultimate in winterproofing. Imagine a semi-subterranean dwelling partially dug into the earth with a substantial wooden framework covered with layers of branches, grass, and then, crucially, a thick layer of earth. These structures were incredibly robust and provided exceptional insulation. The earth itself is a fantastic insulator, acting like a natural thermal mass. The ground-level entrance would often be a long, covered passageway designed to create an airlock effect, minimizing heat loss when people entered or exited. It's the ancient version of a vestibule, really. Inside an earth lodge, a central fire pit would burn, and the smoke would exit through an opening in the roof, much like the other dwellings. But the thick layers of earth and sod meant that once the lodge was warmed, it would retain that heat for an incredibly long time. The earth acted as a giant storage heater, slowly releasing warmth throughout the night. It also made them incredibly resistant to the strong winds of the plains, which, as we know, can really cut through you. Imagine trying to explain passive solar design to someone who hadn't invented the wheel yet. Well, they just figured it out through observation and necessity, because why overcomplicate things when the earth itself can do most of the work for you? Sleeping arrangements in earth lodges would involve platforms, often around the perimeter, covered with mats and furs. The sheer mass of the earth walls and roof meant that the interior temperature would remain remarkably stable, even when external temperatures plummeted far below freezing. These were truly cozy havens in a harsh winter landscape. Now, it wasn't just about the physical structures. There were also behavioral adaptations, because, as we know, human ingenuity isn't just about building things. It's about how we live within them. For many Native American groups, winter was a time for slowing down, for storytelling, for repairing tools, and for staying inside as much as possible. It was a time for communal activities around the fire, for sharing warmth and resources. Clothing, of course, played a massive role. Animal furs and hides were expertly prepared and sewn into warm, layered clothing. Think deerskin, elk skin, buffalo hide, beaver, rabbit, and even bird feathers for insulation. These weren't just fashion statements, they were essential survival gear. Layers were key, trapping air for insulation, much like the layers in their dwellings, and specialized winter moccasins, often lined with fur, kept feet warm and dry. Sometimes you'd even find leggings and mittens lined with rabbit fur, because let's face it, nothing says cozy like a fluffy bunny, even if it's no longer hopping. Food also played a part. Winter diets often included fatty meats and dried foods that provided sustained energy and helped to generate internal heat body. Think pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes berries, which was incredibly caloric and portable. It was the original energy bar, but probably tasted a bit gamier.
Let's not forget about heating methods beyond the main fire. Sometimes hot stones were used. Stones would be heated in the central fire and then carefully moved to other parts of the dwelling, perhaps placed near sleeping areas, to radiate gentle heat for hours. It was like a natural hot water bottle, but with rocks, and less chance of bursting. The design of the entrances was also crucial. For many of these dwellings, the entrance would face away from the prevailing winter winds, or, as in the case of the Earth Lodge, a long, winding entranceway would create a barrier against the direct blast of cold air. Even a simple hide flap over an entrance could make a significant difference in preventing heat loss. It's the little details, right? The things that seem insignificant but add up to make a huge difference in comfort and survival. So when we consider how did Native Americans sleep in winter tents without freezing, it's never just one simple answer. It's a symphony of intelligent design, resourcefulness, communal living, and a deep understanding of the natural world. They weren't just putting up a tent, they were creating a microclimate, a warm sanctuary against the relentless cold. It was a testament to human adaptability and ingenuity long before the days of thermostats and down parkas. Let's float over to some specific regional examples, because while the general principles were similar, the materials and specific adaptations varied greatly depending on the environment. Take the Inuit and other Arctic peoples, for instance. Their winter dwellings, the famous igloos, are perhaps the most iconic example of cold weather architecture. And while not exactly a tent, the principles of insulation are fascinatingly similar. An igloo, as many of you know, is built from blocks of compacted snow, and snow, surprisingly enough, is an excellent insulator. The air trapped within the snow crystals prevents heat from escaping. The dome shape is incredibly strong and sheds wind and snow effectively. Inside an igloo, a small oil lamp or even body heat could raise the temperature significantly above the freezing point, making it surprisingly comfortable, relatively speaking. And like the Earth Lodges, the entrance of an igloo would typically be a long, low tunnel, creating an air trap that prevented cold air from rushing in. They even had raised sleeping platforms within the igloo, again, to get people off the coldest part of the floor. It's like a tiny, frozen, but surprisingly warm hobbit hole. Now, compare that to the Southwest, where winter might not be as brutally cold as the plains or the Arctic, but it could still drop below freezing quite often. Here, the Pueblo people developed multi-story adobe structures. Adobe, a mixture of earth and straw, acts as a thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and slowly releasing it at night. The thick walls provided excellent insulation, and being connected in multi-story complexes also meant shared walls and shared warmth, much like apartment buildings do today, just, with more mud and less drywall. These structures often had small windows and doors, again to minimize heat loss, and the traditional kivas, circular underground ceremonial chambers, would have been incredibly warm and insulated, essentially being earth lodges for communal gatherings. It's all about working with the available materials and understanding their properties. They weren't just building houses, they were building climate control systems using what nature provided. It's easy for us to look back and think of these early peoples as somehow primitive, but their understanding of physics, material science, and engineering, albeit empirical, was incredibly sophisticated. They understood heat transfer, insulation, ventilation, and structural integrity, all without the benefit of formal schooling or advanced mathematics. They learned through generations of trial and error, observation, and direct experience. It's the ultimate example of practical knowledge being passed down, tested, and refined. So, when we're warm in bed at a chilly winter night and think about the past, spare a gentle thought for the people who, with far less, managed to create surprisingly cozy havens against the elements. It wasn't a matter of simply enduring the cold. It was a matter of mastering their environment with ingenuity and a deep, abiding connection to the world around them. Let's gently segue into another fascinating aspect of ancient living that ties into our cozy theme, the materials themselves and how they were prepared. Because it wasn't just what they used, but how they used it.
Take animal hides, for instance. We mentioned bison hides for tipis, but the process of turning a raw hide into a durable, weather-resistant, and flexible covering was a whole art form in itself. It involved tanning, which could be a long and laborious process, using brains, fats, and smoke, not just some chemical solution you pick up at the hardware store. A properly tanned hide was not only soft and pliable, but incredibly tough and water-resistant. If it wasn't processed correctly, it would become stiff and brittle when dry, and heavy and rotten when wet. So the skill of the tanners was paramount to the effectiveness of the winter dwellings and clothing. Imagine trying to explain the complexities of protein-fiber cross-linking to someone who is just trying to make a warm coat, and then realizing they've already figured it out through generations of practical experience, because why wouldn't you when your life depends on it? The same goes for bark and plant materials. Birch bark, for example, used extensively in wigwams and canoes in the Northeast, is naturally water-resistant due to its resin content. But harvesting it without damaging the tree, preparing it, and then sewing or lashing it together into large sheets required immense skill. The weaving of mats from reeds, cattails, or other grasses wasn't just a simple craft. It was a highly developed skill that produced dense, insulating, and durable materials for covering walls and floors. The choices of wood for frameworks were also not arbitrary. Lodgepole pine for teepee poles grows tall and straight, making it ideal for the conical structure. Its flexibility also allowed it to withstand strong winds without snapping. For longhouses and wigwams, sturdy, rot-resistant woods like cedar or oak might have been used for the main support beams, because you definitely don't want your roof collapsing on you in the middle of a blizzard, now do you? That would be less than ideal. Let's think about the thermal properties of the materials themselves. We touched on earth for earth lodges and adobe for pueblo structures. Earth has a high thermal mass, meaning it takes a lot of energy to heat up or cool down, so it tends to maintain a stable temperature. This is why basements are often cooler in summer and warmer in winter. Native builders intuitively understood and exploited this property, building partially into the ground to take advantage of the Earth's natural insulation. Even the color of the materials could play a subtle role. Darker materials, like some barks or smoke-darkened hides, would absorb more solar radiation during the day, contributing to warmth, though in the deep of winter, when the sun is low and often obscured, this might have been a minor factor compared to the structural insulation and internal heating. Another subtle but important aspect was the positioning of dwellings within the landscape. People didn't just plop down their teepees or build their longhouses anywhere. They often chose locations that offered natural protection from winter winds, perhaps in a sheltered valley, on the leeward side of a hill, or in a dense grove of trees. This natural windbreak would significantly reduce the amount of wind chill affecting the dwelling, making the internal heating much more effective. It's like finding the perfect little nook to huddle in on a cold day, but on a much larger architectural scale.
And when we talk about shared body heat in communal dwellings, it's not just a cute concept. It's a measurable thermodynamic contribution. Each human body constantly radiates heat, roughly equivalent to a 100-watt light bulb. So if you have a longhouse with, say, 50 people, that's like having 5,000 watts of continuous heating, just from body heat alone, in addition to the fires. It's a very efficient way to stay warm, even if it does mean less personal space. The concept of a cold sink was also understood. In many of these dwellings, particularly those with raised sleeping platforms, the coldest air would naturally settle at the lowest points. By sleeping on platforms or beds elevated off the floor, people could stay out of the coldest air zone. It's a simple trick of physics, but a highly effective one, especially when you don't have a forced air heating system to circulate the warmth. Let's briefly touch on the social aspects of winter living, because comfort isn't just about physical warmth, it's also about psychological well-being. Winter, especially in harsh climates, could be a challenging time. Resources might be scarce and movement limited. These communal dwellings and the shared experience of winter
fostered strong social bonds. Storytelling, ceremonies, and crafts would often take place during the long winter evenings, strengthening community ties and providing mental stimulation. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about connecting and thriving as a group. A good story by the fire can make even the coldest night feel a little warmer, can't it? So, in summary, the ingenuity of Native American peoples in adapting to harsh winter conditions was truly remarkable. It involved sophisticated architectural designs, meticulous material preparation, intelligent placement within the landscape, and a range of behavioral and social adaptations. From the layered insulation of tipis and wigwams to the thermal mass of earth lodges and adobe structures, they developed effective solutions for staying warm without the benefit of modern technology. Their homes were not just shelters, but finely tuned systems for survival and comfort, born from generations of observation, experimentation, and a deep respect for the natural world. It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest, most elegant solutions are found by looking to nature and working with its principles, rather than constantly trying to dominate or override them. And with that gentle thought, perhaps you can now drift off to sleep, knowing a little more about how warmth was found in the coldest of times. Sweet dreams, history buffs. Let's continue. We've talked about the big picture, the general architectural marvels, and the clever physics involved in keeping warm. But let's zoom in a little bit more on some of the regional nuances and perhaps some of the unsung heroes of winter comfort. Because, as we know, history is always in the details, especially the cozy, sleepy details. We briefly mentioned the Great Lakes region and the wigwams, but let's expand on that just a touch. Imagine the Anishinaabe peoples encompassing the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi navigating the incredibly harsh winters around the vast frozen lakes. Their wigwams weren't just about bent saplings and bark. Oh no, there was often a meticulous process of layering different materials for maximum effect. Sometimes, after the initial framework of bent poles was covered with birch bark or woven mats, an additional layer of deer skin or even moose hide would be added to the inside walls, creating an extra pocket of air for insulation. And these hides weren't always uniform. Sometimes they were patchwork affairs, carefully sewn together from smaller pieces, because waste not, want not, especially when your life depends on it. Imagine the patience required to prepare all those hides and stitch them together with sinew, especially when your fingers are probably already numb from the cold. But it was a labor of love, a necessity for survival. And the flooring in these wigwams could be quite elaborate. Beyond just dried leaves and furs, some communities would create raised sleeping platforms or even sunken areas for heat retention. The ground might be dug out a few inches and then lined with insulating materials, creating a slight cold sink effect, allowing the warmer air to rise above the sleeping areas. It's a subtle distinction, but in sub-zero temperatures, every degree counted, every single one. The Great Lakes region also had a rich tradition of using cedar bark for various purposes, including some dwellings. Cedar bark, particularly the inner bark, could be processed into soft, pliable strips that were excellent for weaving and for creating insulating layers. It also has a lovely natural scent, which, let's be honest, probably helped a bit with the communal living aspect. Because when you're sharing a small space with multiple families all winter, a little bit of pleasant aroma can go a long way. Let's gently glide over to the Pacific Northwest coast. Now, you might think of this region as mild and rainy, but inland and at higher elevations, winters could be surprisingly cold, with heavy snowfall. Here, you'd find large, impressive plank houses, often built from cedar. These weren't tents in the traditional sense, but their adaptation for warmth is worth noting. These plank houses were substantial structures made from massive cedar planks split from ancient trees. The planks were then fitted together, often without nails, relying on precise joinery and a sturdy framework. The thick cedar planks themselves provided a good amount of insulation, and the tightly fitted nature of the construction helped to keep out drafts. Inside, similar to the longhouses, there would be multiple hearths for fires, providing warmth for the various family groups living within the communal structure. Smoke holes in the roof, sometimes with adjustable covers, would allow smoke to escape. And again, raised sleeping platforms, often along the perimeter, covered with mats and furs, would keep people off the cold ground. The sheer size and mass of these wooden structures meant they would retain heat quite effectively once warmed. They were like giant, beautifully carved wooden thermal batteries.
The Coast Salish people, for example, often had winter villages with these large plank houses. During the colder months, people would consolidate into these more permanent, well-insulated dwellings, focusing on resource management, storytelling, and ceremonial life. It was a time of internal focus, conserving energy and resources, and sharing the warmth of the community. Let's consider the subtler methods of warmth, beyond just fire and thick walls. The power of shared blankets and robes cannot be underestimated. Imagine a large family, all sleeping together under a stack of buffalo robes, each person contributing their body heat to the collective warmth. It's an age-old survival strategy, still used by modern campers when things get really cold. You create a shared thermal envelope, a little human furnace. The preparation of bedding materials was also an art. Not just hides, but also woven blankets made from plant fibers or even dog hair, sometimes interwoven with feathers for extra loft and insulation. These were often meticulously crafted, soft and warm, providing crucial layers against the night's chill. It wasn't just about covering up, it was about creating layers of trapped air, because trapped air, as we've established, is your best friend when it comes to keeping warm. And what about those chilly nights when you needed to leave the warmth of your dwelling? Enter the concept of layered winter clothing, often made from deerskin or caribou hide, depending on the region. Trousers, shirts, parkas, mittens, and moccasins, all carefully sewn and often lined with fur. Sometimes a parka might even have a fur ruff around the hood, specifically designed to protect the face from frostbite by trapping a layer of warm air. It's a design element that modern winter coats still emulate because, well, it works. Why reinvent the wheel when the wheel, or in this case the fur ruff, is already perfectly functional? The use of snow itself as an insulator is another fascinating aspect. We talked about igloos, but even with tipis or wigwams, people would often bank snow around the base of their dwellings. This created an additional layer of insulation, sealing off drafts and further preventing heat loss from the ground. Snow, when packed properly, is surprisingly effective at trapping air, making it a natural, abundant, and free insulating material. It's like having an infinite supply of free insulation just delivered by nature itself. Let's consider the internal organization of space within these dwellings. Even in a seemingly open space like a teepee, there would often be designated sleeping areas, often along the back wall, farthest from the entrance, where it would be warmest. The fire, while central, was carefully managed. Sometimes stones would be placed around the fire pit, not just to contain the fire, but to absorb and radiate heat over a longer period. It's like a primitive radiant floor heating system, but localized and powered by wood. The concept of a raised hearth in some dwellings also contributed to efficiency. By raising the fire pit slightly, the heat could radiate more effectively into the living space rather than being absorbed directly by the cold ground. It's a subtle engineering tweak that makes a noticeable difference, especially when every calorie of heat is precious. And the sheer resourcefulness of using whatever was available is always astounding. In some treeless regions, for example, dried buffalo dung or buffalo chips were used for fuel for fires.
While perhaps not as romantic as a crackling wood fire, these provided a surprisingly long-lasting and effective source of heat because, well, when you're cold, you're not picky about your fuel source, are you? You use what you've got. The practice of smudge fires for drying and curing hides inside dwellings also inadvertently contributed to warmth and a slight smoky smell that permeated everything. While perhaps not intended solely for heating, any fire contributes heat, and when you're curing hides over a slow burn, you're getting a 2-for-1 deal, warm and productive. It's important to remember that these weren't just temporary shelters. These were homes lived in for months at a time. The cumulative knowledge of generations went into making them as comfortable and livable as possible. The design of a teepee, for example, was refined over hundreds, if not thousands of years, each generation adding their own observations and improvements. It wasn't a static design, but an evolving one, adapting to changes in environment, available materials, and cultural practices. It was a slow, steady evolution towards optimal warmth and comfort. Let's just gently shift our focus to the human element, the pure grit and resilience that also played a role. While ingenious dwellings and warm clothing provided physical comfort, there was also a mental fortitude involved in facing down winter. The cultural practices, the communal support, the belief systems all contributed to enduring the cold season. It wasn't just about the physical structures, it was about the strength of the people within them. Because a warm house is great, but a warm heart surrounded by a supportive community is even better. And the subtle rhythms of life during winter. It wasn't just about huddling indoors. There would be necessary trips for hunting, trapping, or gathering firewood. These trips would be carefully planned, and people would be expertly dressed for the cold, sometimes with snowshoes or skis for navigating deep snow. The knowledge of the land, the weather patterns, and the behavior of animals was paramount for successful winter survival. It was a constant dance with nature, a push and pull, a negotiation for warmth and sustenance. So, to reiterate, how did Native Americans sleep in winter tents without freezing? It was a masterful combination of ingenious architecture, sophisticated material science, clever use of environmental factors, communal living, and deep-seated cultural knowledge. Their dwellings were not just structures, they were living embodiments of centuries of accumulated wisdom, designed to create havens of warmth and comfort in the face of nature's harshest challenges. It's a truly remarkable story of human adaptation and resilience, a testament to the power of observation and ingenuity. And with that, I hope you're feeling even cozier and perhaps just a little bit more educated. Sweet dreams, my friends. We've covered a lot of ground, both literally and figuratively.
Let's gently ease into an even deeper dive, because the story of warmth in winter is never just about one type of dwelling or one tribe. It's a tapestry woven from countless threads of innovation across an entire continent. We've touched on the plains, the Northeast, the Arctic, and the Southwest, but what about the less commonly discussed regions? What about the subtle variations, the clever little tweaks that made all the difference? Consider the Plateau region, encompassing parts of modern-day Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and British Columbia. Here, tribes like the Nez Perce, Flathead, and Yakima faced distinct winter challenges. They weren't always in deep snow like the Rockies, but they had cold, often damp winters and strong winds. Their winter dwellings were often semi-subterranean, like the earth lodges we discussed, but with their own unique characteristics. These structures were often called pit houses or kikuli by some groups. Imagine a large circular pit, sometimes several feet deep, dug into the earth. A sturdy conical or dome-shaped framework of poles would be built over this pit, covered with layers of bark, reeds, grass, and then, crucially, a thick layer of earth. A central smoke hole allowed for ventilation, and a side entrance, often a sloping tunnel, acted as an airlock. The genius here was twofold.
The Earth provided immense insulation, stabilizing the internal temperature, and the semi-subterranean design protected against the fierce winds. It was like living in a very cozy, well-camouflaged bunker. And inside, a central fire pit would warm the entire space. Sleeping areas would be on raised platforms or simply on insulated mats on the floor, because why wouldn't you want to maximize every bit of warmth when the wind outside is trying to peel the bark off the trees? The pit house dwellers also had clever ways of managing the interior. Sometimes a small, shallow trench would be dug around the inside perimeter, acting as a cold trap, allowing the coldest air to settle there, keeping the main living and sleeping areas warmer. It's a simple idea, but highly effective, a testament to their deep understanding of airflow and thermal dynamics. Let's drift over to the southeast, a region often associated with warmth and humidity. But even here, in places like the Appalachian Mountains or higher elevations, winters could be surprisingly harsh, with ice storms and freezing temperatures. Tribes like the Cherokee, Creek, and Choctaw had their own ingenious solutions. Often, these groups would have two types of houses: a summer house, designed for ventilation and cooling, and a winter house, built specifically for warmth. The winter house would typically be smaller, round or oval in shape, and often more heavily insulated. It might have thicker walls made of wattle and daub, or even logs, providing more thermal mass than the lighter summer dwellings. And the insulation wouldn't stop at the walls. The roof might be heavily thatched with layers of straw or reeds, sometimes several feet thick, creating an incredibly effective insulating layer. Inside, a central fire pit would warm the entire space. Sleeping areas would be on raised platforms or simply on insulated mats on the floor, because why wouldn't you want to maximize every bit of warmth when the wind outside is trying to peel the bark off the trees? The use of communal heating in these winter houses was also common. Multiple families might share a larger winter structure, or individual families would huddle together, sharing body heat.
The thermodynamics of bark and bone. So we've drifted through the general architecture, but let's settle deeper into the actual science of the sleep, the physics that allowed a person to close their eyes in a birch bark wigwam while a blizzard raged outside, and actually wake up with all 10 toes still attached. It's one thing to build a wall, it's another to understand how to manipulate the very air around you. The invisible blanket. The physics of convection. You see, the real enemy wasn't just the cold, it was the draft. In a modern house, we have seals and caulking, but in a winter lodge, the air was a living thing. The Native American engineers, and let's call them that because that's exactly what they were, understood a principle we now call the stack effect. Inside a teepee or a wigwam, as the fire burned, the air became buoyant. It rose toward the smoke hole. But instead of just letting all that precious warmth escape, they used the lining we mentioned earlier to create a controlled intake. By lifting the outer cover slightly and keeping the inner liner tight to the ground, they forced the cold air to travel up between the two layers before it reached the living space. This pre-warmed the air and pushed the smoke out more efficiently. It was essentially a low-tech, high-efficiency HVAC system. The art of the insulated bed. Now, let's talk about where the actual sleeping happened. You couldn't just lie on the ground. The earth in winter is a heat sink. It's a greedy thing that wants to suck the warmth right out of your core. To counter this, the bedding was a multi-layered masterpiece of soft engineering. The moisture barrier, usually a layer of waterproof hide or thick bark, was placed first to keep ground dampness away. The loft, next, came branches, specifically evergreen boughs like hemlock or cedar. These weren't just for the smell, though after 3 months in a lodge with 10 relatives, the scent of cedar was probably a blessing. These branches created dead air space. The thermal layer. On top of the branches went the heavy hitters, buffalo robes or bear skins. A buffalo robe is a fascinating thing. Each hair is hollow, acting like a tiny thermos. When you wrap yourself in a buffalo robe, you aren't just wearing a blanket, you are inhabiting a vacuum-sealed insulation chamber.
It's no wonder they looked at the European wool blankets with a bit of skepticism at first. Wool is great, but it's no hollow-haired bison. Regional quirps, the subterranean snug. If we float further north to the plateau and subarctic regions, we find the pit house, because why fight the wind when you can just hide from it? These structures were dug into the ground, and for good reason. Once you get about 4 feet below the frost line, the Earth stays a consistent, albeit chilly, temperature. By building downward, they used the planet itself as an insulator. The roofs were often covered in a foot or more of sod. In the winter, snow would pile on top of that sod. Now, we think of snow as cold, but to a survivalist, snow is white gold. It's 90% trapped air. A thick layer of snow on a roof is effectively a giant piece of styrofoam. Inside these pit houses, the air would become so still and so insulated that a single small fire could keep the room at a temperature that we would today call aggressively cozy. The cold trap entrance. One of my favorite snarky little details of indigenous design is the cold trap entrance. In many winter dwellings, the entrance tunnel was built lower than the main floor. Since cold air is heavier than warm air, it would literally fall into the tunnel and get stuck there, unable to climb up into the main living area. It was a physical barrier made of physics itself. Imagine a royal palace in Europe at the same time. Drafty stone walls, high ceilings that sent all the heat to the rafters while the king's feet froze on the marble. Meanwhile, in a Haudenosaunee longhouse or a Mandan earth lodge, people were lounging in their shirt sleeves because they actually understood how air moves. It's a bit of a historical irony, isn't it? The civilized world was shivering in stone boxes, while the wild world was mastering thermodynamics. The communal furnace. We also have to mention the biological heater. In a longhouse, you weren't just sleeping with your family, you were sleeping in a building that might hold 60 people and several dogs. A human being at rest puts out about 350 BTUs of heat per hour. Multiply that by 60, add in 3 or 4 constant fires and the sheer thermal mass of the building itself, and you have a structure that stays warm through the night even after the fires dim to coals. They would sleep on raised platforms. Why? Because the air at the floor was 10 degrees colder than the air 3 feet up. It's simple, it's brilliant, and it's the reason they didn't wake up as icicles.
The art of the winter long game. So there we were, sitting in the glow of a fire, listening to an elder explain why the crow is black or how the stars got into the sky. It's a nice image, right? But while the stories were flowing, people's hands were rarely idle. Winter was the ultimate season for maintenance and craftsmanship. Because, let's be real, if you're stuck inside for 3 weeks because a blizzard has turned the outside world into a giant bowl of milk, you're going to get bored of just staring at the hide walls. This was the time for the meticulous work that summer's frantic pace didn't allow. Think of it as the ultimate indoor project season. Men would spend hours, days really, finessing tool handles, knapping flint for new arrowheads, or repairing snowshoes. Because if your snowshoe snaps 3 miles from camp in February, that's not just a bad day, that's a you are now part of the permafrost day. Women, meanwhile, were often engaged in the incredibly labor-intensive process of turning those raw hides we mentioned earlier into actual clothing. Have you ever tried to sew through buffalo hide with a bone needle? It's not exactly like darning a sock. It takes immense strength and patience. This was also when the beautiful, intricate quill work and beadwork happened. If you've ever seen a stunningly decorated 18th century moccasin and wondered, who had the time for this? The answer is someone who was snowed in and had reached the limit of their patience with their brother-in-law's snoring. The logistics of the midnight run. Now, let's get a bit practical and perhaps a little bit awkward. We've talked about sleeping and eating, but we have to talk about, well, the plumbing, or lack thereof. When it's minus 30 degrees Celsius outside with a wind chill that could peel paint, the last thing anyone wants to do is leave the cozy, fur-lined teepee for a nature break.
In many cultures, they were quite pragmatic about this. For small business, so to speak, many dwellings had what was essentially a night vessel, usually a sturdy, dedicated pot or a waterproofed basket. It wasn't glamorous, but it beat frostbite in places you really don't want frostbite. For more significant ventures, one would have to bundle up and head to a designated area downwind of the camp. It was a brisk, efficient process. No one was out there scrolling through their phone. You did your business, and you scrambled back to the fire as fast as your fur-lined leggings could carry you. Medicinal wisdom and winter blues. Of course, being cooped up together also meant that if one person caught a sniffle, everyone caught a sniffle. Native American medicine was remarkably sophisticated, utilizing a vast pharmacopoeia of local plants. In the winter, this often meant relying on dried herbs or bark harvested earlier in the year. Willow bark, for example, contains salicin, which is basically nature's aspirin. They'd brew it into a tea to handle the aches and pains that come from sleeping on the ground or working in the cold. Then there were the infusions of evergreen needles, pine, spruce, or cedar. These are packed with vitamin C. Long before Europeans realized that scurvy was caused by a lack of fresh fruit, many native groups were drinking evergreen tea to stay healthy during the months when nothing green was growing. It's ironic, really. The civilized explorers were losing their teeth to scurvy, while the primitive locals were sipping on pine needle lattes and feeling just fine. The psychological chill. We should also talk about the mental game. Survival isn't just about calories and insulation. It's about not losing your mind when you haven't seen the sun in 10 days. Many tribes had winter festivals or specific games designed to keep spirits high. Ever heard of Snow Snake? It was a popular game among northern tribes like the Haudenosaunee. You'd take a long, polished wooden rod, the snake, and see how far you could slide it down a track made in the snow. It sounds simple, but it was highly competitive, involving bedding and specialized waxes made from animal fats to make the sticks slide faster. It gave the men a reason to get outside, move their muscles, and engage in some healthy, low-stakes tribal rivalry. And then there were the children. Kids are kids, regardless of the century. They'd play with dolls made of corn husks or buckskin, or play ring and pin games. It was all about keeping the atmosphere light. If the mood in the lodge turned sour, the winter felt twice as long. The transition to spring. As the days finally began to lengthen, the focus shifted again. You'd start to see the sugar moon or the maple moon in the northeast. This was a time of great excitement, the first sign that the deep freeze was breaking. The community would move to sugar camps to harvest maple sap. It was hard work, but it was sweet work, and it signaled that they had once again beaten the winter at its own game. They didn't just survive the winter, they navigated it with a level of expertise that we've mostly forgotten. They knew how to read the ice, how to predict a storm by the way the smoke curled, and how to stay warm by working with the laws of physics rather than trying to fight them. So, as you drift off, maybe think about that inner liner of the teepee, that silent, invisible pocket of air that stood between a family and the howling void of the plains. It's a pretty cozy thought to end on.
The winter soul, storytelling, stillness, and the social furnace. So, we've built the walls, we've layered the bison robes, and we've donned our hollow-haired caribou parkas. Physically, we're doing all right. But now we have to deal with the most dangerous part of winter, the 4 months of being stuck inside with your aunt, your 3 cousins, and a very bored dog. This is where we look at the psychological architecture of the winter camp. Because, as it turns out, Native Americans didn't just survive winter, they used it as their university season. The psychology of the circle. In a modern house, we have rooms, we can close doors. If you're annoyed with someone, you can go to the kitchen or the garage. In a winter teepee or longhouse, there are no doors. There is only the circle. To survive this, without everyone losing their minds, these cultures developed a social code that was as refined as their insulation. There was a profound emphasis on soft speaking. Loud voices were for the hunt or for war. Inside the winter lodge, the tone was kept low,
melodic and calm. It's almost as if the entire society agreed to live in a sleepy historian monologue for 4 months. This wasn't just about being polite, it was about keeping the communal temperature stable. When you're living in a 20-foot circle, an emotional outburst is like a draft. It chills everyone. Winter, the season of the story. For many tribes, particularly the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, there were certain stories that could only be told when there was snow on the ground. Why? Well, the snarky historical answer is that in the summer you were too busy working to sit through a 6-hour epic about a trickster rabbit. But the spiritual answer was that the spirits of the earth were asleep under the snow, so they wouldn't overhear you talking about them. Winter was the time for the oral tradition. This wasn't just entertainment, it was the library. While the wind howled outside, the elders would recount the history of the people, the laws of the land, and the genealogies of every family in the lodge. Children would listen, tucked into their furs, absorbing their entire culture through the ears. If you think about it, the extremely long, sleep-inducing monologue is actually a deeply traditional Native American winter pastime. I'm just continuing the tradition, really. String games and bone dice. Now, kids will be kids, and even the most disciplined child gets the lodge fever after a week of blizzards. To combat this, they had an array of games that required zero space. Cat's Cradle. This wasn't just a toy. String figures were used to illustrate stories. You weren't just making a diamond, you were making the constellation of the Great Bear. The Peach Stone Game, a favorite among the Iroquois. It involved shaking blackened stones or pits in a bowl. It was a game of chance that could last for days, played between different clans within the longhouse. The Moccasin Game, a game of hidden objects and bluffing that was so intense it often involved high-stakes betting, though in winter, high stakes might just mean a particularly nice pair of mittens. These games kept the mind sharp and the social bonds tight. It turned a period of forced confinement into a season of team building. The Winter Count. For the Plains tribes, winter was also the time for record keeping. They used what was called a winter count. A designated tribal historian would select the most important event of the past year, a great meteor shower, a particularly hard frost, or a successful peace treaty, and paint a single pictograph on a bison hide. During the long winter nights, the hide would be brought out and the historian would point to each symbol, reciting the history of the tribe going back 100 years. It was a chronological map of the soul of the people. While Europeans were writing their histories in heavy books that only the elite could read, Native Americans were painting theirs on the very robes that kept them warm. It's a beautiful bit of efficiency, isn't it? The stillness as a tool. There's a misconception that winter was a time of misery, but many indigenous accounts describe it as a time of profound peace. In the summer, the world is loud and demanding. In the winter, the world is quiet. This stillness was used for reflection, for repairing tools with meticulous care, and for deep sleep. They understood that the human body needs to hibernate to some extent. By aligning their social and mental lives with the slowing down of the earth, they avoided the burnout we feel in the modern world, where we try to pretend January is the same as July. They leaned into the dark. They leaned into the quiet. And they found that if you have enough wood, enough dried meat, and a good story, the winter isn't an enemy, it's a sanctuary.
The gear that defied the frost. So we've covered the big picture. The houses, the food, the social vibes. But let's zoom in a little bit. Imagine you actually had to leave the teepee. Maybe a scout reported signs of elk, or maybe you just really needed to get away from your uncle's repetitive stories for an hour. You couldn't just throw on a North Face jacket and some Gore-Tex boots. You had to rely on what I like to call high-tech Stone Age gear. And honestly, some of it was better than what we have now. Let's start with the feet. If you've ever tried to walk through 3 feet of fresh powder in regular shoes, you know you just sink until you're waist deep and questioning all your life choices. The solution, of course, was the snowshoe.
But these weren't just tennis rackets for your feet. They were masterpieces of structural engineering. Different terrains required different shapes. If you were in the dense forests of the Northeast, you'd use a bear paw design, short, wide, and rounded. Why? Because a long trailing tail would get snagged on every bush and fallen log in the woods, which is a great way to end up face first in a drift. But if you were out on the open plains or across frozen lakes, you'd use the long, elegant Yukon style. These had long tails that acted like a rudder, keeping the shoe straight and helping you glide over the crust of the snow with minimal effort. The frames were usually made of ash or birch, woods that are flexible when steamed but tough as nails once they dry. The webbing? That was babiche, or untanned caribou or deer rawhide. It was woven in intricate patterns that were both beautiful and functional. The gaps were exactly the right size to let loose snow fall through so the shoe didn't get heavy, while still providing enough surface area to keep you afloat. It's a delicate balance, and they nailed it. The original layering system. Now, let's talk about the clothes. Modern hikers talk about layering like they invented it in a lab in the 90s, but Native Americans had perfected the system centuries prior. The base layer was usually soft, brain-tanned buckskin. It was breathable and felt like a second skin. But the real MVP of winter fashion was fur-in clothing. For the Inuit and many subarctic tribes, the secret was caribou skin. Caribou hair is unique because each individual hair is hollow. It traps a tiny pocket of air inside the hair itself. When you wear a parka made of caribou skin with the fur facing inward against your body, you're essentially wearing a vacuum-sealed thermos. Then, they'd often wear a second layer with the fur facing outward. This created a double-walled insulation system that was so effective, a person could literally sleep out on the open ice in a blizzard and stay perfectly warm. It's the kind of warmth that feels heavy and solid, like being hugged by a very large, very friendly bear. And we can't forget the extremities. Mittens were often made of thick moose hide, lined with rabbit fur or dried grass for extra insulation. Sometimes they were attached to a long cord that went around the neck, the original toddler string, because losing a mitten in a sub-zero forest wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a medical emergency. The physics of the sled. Of course, if you're moving camp or bringing back meat from a hunt, you aren't carrying it on your back if you can help it. Enter the toboggan. The word itself comes from the Mi'kmaq word tabakwan. Unlike a European sled with runners, which would sink into deep, soft snow, a toboggan is flat-bottomed. It's designed to float on top of the powder, distributing the weight of the load over a large area. They were made of thin, fire-bent boards of larch or birch. They were light, incredibly durable, and could carry hundreds of pounds of pemmican and hides across the frozen wilderness with a single person or a couple of dogs pulling them. It's the ultimate low-friction transport. The silent landscape. Imagine the sound of this world, or rather the lack of it. Winter in the old days was incredibly quiet. The snow acts as a natural acoustic dampener, soaking up sound until the world feels like it's wrapped in cotton wool. You'd hear the rhythmic crunch, swoosh of snowshoes, the occasional crack of a frost tree, when the sap inside a tree freezes so fast the trunk literally explodes, and the low moan of the wind through the pines. It was a slow-motion life. Everything took longer. Getting water meant melting snow or chipping through 3 feet of ice on a lake. Starting a fire wasn't a flick of a lighter. It was a patient conversation with a drill and a piece of tinder. But in that slowness, there was a kind of peace. You weren't fighting the winter. You were living inside it. You weren't a visitor in the cold. You were part of the landscape, just like the willow ptarmigan or the lynx. There's something deeply comforting about that level of belonging. No thermostats, no power grids, just the heat of a fire, the thickness of a hide, and the knowledge passed down from 1,000 grandfathers on how to stay alive when the world turns white.